A millionaire, who believed he had long moved on from a love that had shaped his past, was stunned when he found that very woman on the streets, begging for survival with her 3 young children. The shock turned into a whirlwind of emotions and decisions that would change everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and family. Stay tuned to witness a story that unfolds with dramatic revelations, powerful reunions, and a journey of redemption that no one could have anticipated. Alexander Davenport was a man who had everything that money could buy. At 42, he had built a business empire that spanned multiple industries, from real estate to technology. His life was a whirlwind of meetings, private jets, charity galas, and high-stakes deals. On the surface, everything appeared perfect. A handsome man in an impeccable suit, driving luxury cars, and living in an opulent penthouse overlooking the city. But behind the veneer of success, Alexander carried a loneliness that hadn't, a void he had never been able to fill, no matter how much he achieved. Years ago, Alexander had known a love so profound that it changed him forever. Her name was Isabella. They had met in college, back when Alexander was not the polished businessman he was today, but a struggling student who dreamed of something more. Isabella had been his anchor, the one person who believed in him when no one else did. She was vibrant, compassionate, and filled with a light that drew everyone to her. They had made promises to each other, of a future together, of building a life filled with love and adventure. But life, as it often does, had different plans. Alexander's ambitions had driven a wedge between them. He wanted to build something great, to become someone powerful, while Isabella cherished the simple joys, love, laughter, and a life lived in the moment. The pressures of his growing career had strained their relationship, and eventually they parted ways. It was not a bitter breakup. It was filled with tears and whispered words of love that simply couldn't survive the weight of his aspirations. They had gone their separate ways, and Alexander had buried the pain deep inside, focusing instead on his career, believing that success could numb the ache of losing her. Years passed, and Alexander became everything he had set out to be. He had wealth, power, and influence, but the price had been steep. He had dated beautiful women, attended glamorous parties, but none of it had ever compared to the warmth and love he had once shared with Isabella. She was the one person who had ever truly known him, the one person who saw beyond his ambitions to the man beneath. He had tried to move on, but a part of him had always wondered what had become of her, where she was if she was happy. One chilly afternoon, as Alexander was returning from a business meeting, something happened that shook his world to its core. His driver had taken a different route home, avoiding heavy traffic, and they found themselves passing through a less affluent part of the city. Alexander was glancing absently out of the window, lost in thought, when he saw something that made his heart stop. There, on the corner of a street, sitting on the cold pavement, was a woman. Her hair was tied back loosely, her face etched with lines of exhaustion, and beside her were 3 children, 2 boys and a little girl. They were huddled together, their clothes worn and shabby, their eyes wide with uncertainty. And though her face had changed with the years, Alexander knew without a shadow of a doubt that it was Isabella. His breath caught in his throat, and he felt his chest tighten with a mix of disbelief and panic. He ordered his driver to stop, his voice trembling as he spoke. The car pulled over and Alexander stepped out, his heart pounding as he approached her. She was looking down, her eyes filled with worry as she spoke softly to the children, unaware of the man standing just a few feet away. "Isabella?" he said, his voice barely a whisper, as if he were afraid that saying her name too loudly would make her vanish. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Her eyes widened in shock, her face paling as she took in the sight of him. "Alexander?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Alexander knelt down in front of her, his heart breaking at the sight of her like this. She looked so different from the woman he remembered. Her eyes, once filled with joy, were now shadowed with weariness. He glanced at the children, who were staring at him with wide eyes, and then back at Isabella. What? What happened? He asked, his voice trembling. How did you end up here? Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes and she shook her head, her voice barely audible. It's a long story, Alexander, she said, her voice filled with a pain that cut through him like a knife. I didn't expect to see you. Not like this. Alexander swallowed hard, his mind racing. He couldn't understand how this had happened, how the woman who had once been his whole world had ended up in such dire straits. He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. Come with me, he said, his voice filled with emotion. Let me help you, Isabella. Please. Isabella hesitated, her eyes flickering to her children. The oldest boy, who looked to be around 10, stepped closer to his mother, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Mom? He asked, his voice small. Alexander looked at the boy, his heart clenching. He could see the fear in the child's eyes, the confusion. He turned back to Isabella, his voice softening. I promise, I just want to help. You don't have to go through this alone. Isabella looked at her children, her heart aching. She had spent years trying to make ends meet, trying to give her children the best life she could despite the circumstances. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to keep going no matter how hard things got. But now, faced with Alexander, with the man she had once loved offering her a lifeline, she felt her resolve begin to crumble. Slowly, she nodded, her eyes meeting his. Okay, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Okay, Alexander. Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a sense of relief washing over him. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. Isabella took it, her hand trembling as she rose to her feet, her children clinging to her. Alexander looked at them, his heart breaking at the sight of their worn clothes, their wide, uncertain eyes. He knelt down, his voice gentle as he spoke to them. It's going to be okay, he said. I'm going to take care of you, all of you. The children looked at their mother, and then at Alexander, their eyes filled with hope and fear. Isabella nodded, her voice soft as she spoke to them. It's okay, she said. We're going to be okay. Alexander led them to his car, his heart pounding as they climbed inside. He couldn't believe what was happening, couldn't believe that, after all these years, he had found Isabella again and in such heartbreaking circumstances. He looked at her, his eyes filled with emotion. I'll take you home, he said. We'll figure this out together. Isabella nodded, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if she could trust Alexander after all these years. But as she looked at her children, as she saw the hope in their eyes, she knew that she had to try. For them, for herself, and for the love that she had once shared with the man sitting beside her. And so, as the car pulled away, Alexander and Isabella began a journey that neither of them had expected, a journey of healing, of redemption, and perhaps of a love that had never truly faded. It was the beginning of something new, something that would test them both but also bring them closer than they had ever been before. The first few days after their reunion were a whirlwind of emotions for both Alexander and Isabella. He had brought her and her children to his luxurious penthouse, an extravagant home that was never intended for a family, let alone a woman and 3 children who had lived on the streets. Isabella and her children were dazzled, but also deeply uncomfortable in such a large, pristine, and cold place. It felt unreal, as if they were simply passing through a dream that was not their own. Alexander did everything he could to make them comfortable. He bought new clothes for the children, toys that made their eyes light up with joy, and furnished an entire room to accommodate them. He knew that he was doing everything he could materially, but the emotional discomfort hung in the air. He could sense that it wasn't just physical comfort that Isabella lacked. Something had fundamentally changed in her, something deeper that he struggled to understand. Isabella, on the other hand, was trying her best to adapt, but she felt out of place, like she was living in a fairy tale that wasn't meant for her. She couldn't shake off the memories of how hard it had been to survive alone with her children for all those years. Looking at Alexander, dressed in his fine suits, always busy with meetings and business engagements, reminded her of everything that had separated them in the past. They were from different worlds, and being in the Millionaire's penthouse felt surreal, almost like she was intruding into a life that wasn't hers. One morning, Isabella woke up in the room Alexander had prepared for her and the children. She got up, tended to the little ones, and got ready to head down to the kitchen. The penthouse was enormous, yet she felt like she was suffocating under the weight of the lavish decorations and the comforts that had always been out of reach for her. When she entered the kitchen, she found Alexander already there, dressed for work, reading a newspaper while sipping his coffee. "Good morning," he said, looking up at her with a smile. Isabella gave him a small, polite smile. "Good morning," she replied softly. She moved towards the counter, unsure of where anything was. Everything was so pristine and unfamiliar. Stainless steel appliances, marble countertops, and gadgets she'd never seen before. She hesitated, feeling out of place. "Let me help you," Alexander said, getting up from his seat. He moved over to her side, opening cabinets and taking out cups and plates. Isabella watched him, a mixture of gratitude and discomfort washing over her. She was used to doing everything herself. Having someone like Alexander, someone she had once loved but lost, helping her now felt both comforting and strange. Alexander poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her, his eyes searching her face. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. Isabella took a deep breath, looking down at her coffee cup. "I'm trying to adjust," she admitted. "This is all very different from what I'm used to." Alexander nodded, his heart aching at her words. He could see the unease in her eyes, the way she held herself, as if she were afraid to touch anything for fear of breaking it. He wanted to make her feel comfortable, wanted to give her the life she deserved, but he didn't know how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. "I know it's a lot," he said softly, "but you don't have to worry about anything. I want you to feel at home here. You and the children, you're safe now." Isabella looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Thank you, Alexander," she said. "I appreciate everything you've done for us. But it's hard. It's hard to just forget everything that's happened. The years, the struggles. It's all still very real to me." Alexander nodded, the pain in her voice cutting through him. He reached out, gently placing his hand on hers. "I understand," he said, "and I'm not expecting you to forget. I just want to help in any way that I can." Isabella looked at his hand on hers, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. She had loved this man once, loved him with everything she had, and now here he was, offering her a lifeline when she needed it most. But the years apart, the hardships she had faced, they had changed her. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she and Alexander were together. She had learned to be strong, to survive, and accepting help, even from someone she once loved, was difficult. As the days passed, the tension between them grew. Alexander tried to make himself available for Isabella and the children, but his business demanded much of his time. He was often away at meetings or on the phone, dealing with the many responsibilities that came with running an empire. He wanted to be there for Isabella, to help her transition into this new life, but he struggled to balance his work with his desire to be present. Isabella, meanwhile, tried her best to fit in, but the opulence of Alexander's world was overwhelming. She spent her days caring for her children, trying to make them feel at ease in this unfamiliar environment. The kids were slowly adjusting. They loved the new clothes, the toys, the warm beds, but Isabella couldn't shake the feeling of not belonging. The lavishness of Alexander's penthouse was a constant reminder of the life he had built without her, the life she had never been a part of. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Alexander found Isabella sitting on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. He walked over to her, his footsteps soft against the marble floor. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Isabella looked up, giving him a small nod. "Of course," she said. Alexander sat down beside her, the cool night air wrapping around them. He looked at her face illuminated by the soft glow of the city below. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said quietly, "and I know I can't make up for everything you've been through. But I want to try. I want to make things right." Isabella sighed, her gaze still fixed on the city lights. "I appreciate that, Alexander, I really do. But it's not just about the material things, it's everything. The past, the choices we made, the time we lost." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "I've changed. I'm not the same person I was back then. And neither are you." Alexander's heart clenched at her words. He knew she was right. The years had changed them both, in ways that neither of them fully understood. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "Maybe we have changed," he said. "But that doesn't mean we can't find a way forward. I still care about you, Isabella. I always have." Isabella looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I care about you too, Alexander. But I don't know if we can go back to what we were. Too much has happened. I've had to fight for so long, and I don't know how to just let go of that." Alexander nodded, his heart aching. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of everything she had been through. He wished he could take it all away, could make her forget the hardships she had faced. But he knew that wasn't possible. All he could do was be there for her, to show her that she wasn't alone anymore. "Maybe we can't go back," he said softly. "But maybe we can build something new, something different but just as real." Isabella looked at him, her heart torn. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could find a way to be happy again. But the fear of being hurt, of losing everything once more, held her back. She looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know, Alexander, I don't know." They sat in silence, the city lights twinkling below them, the weight of their pasts hanging between them. It was a moment filled with uncertainty, with the possibility of both hope and heartbreak. They had found each other again, but whether they could truly rebuild what they had lost remained to be seen. And as the night wore on, Alexander knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But he also knew that he was willing to fight, for Isabella, for her children, and for the love that had never truly left his heart. It had been a few weeks since Isabella and her children had moved into Alexander's penthouse, and while the tension between them remained, a sense of routine began to develop. Alexander made every effort to create a space where Isabella and the kids could feel safe. He ensured the children were enrolled in a local school, and he made time in his hectic schedule to take them on small outings, something to make them smile and let them feel like they belonged. Isabella appreciated his efforts, but she couldn't shake off the constant feeling of imbalance. Her life, which had been filled with daily struggles and uncertainty, was now surrounded by wealth and privilege, elements she had once imagined but had never desired. She didn't know how to reconcile these two parts of herself, the mother who had fought so hard for her children's survival, and the woman who now lived in luxury, supported by a man she once loved. One afternoon, Isabella received a call from the school. Her oldest son, Matthew, had gotten into a fight. Isabella's heart sank as she hurried to the school, her mind racing with worry. When she arrived, she found Matthew sitting in the principal's office, his eyes downcast and a bruise forming on his cheek. "What happened?" Isabella asked, kneeling beside him, her voice filled with concern. Matthew looked at her, his eyes welling with tears. "They were saying things, Mom," he whispered. About you." Isabella's heart clenched. She turned to the principal, who gave her a sympathetic look. "It seems some of the other students found out about your situation before moving here," he said delicately. "They were saying some pretty harsh things." Matthew reacted and, well, it escalated. Isabella felt her chest tighten, a mix of anger and sadness washing over her. She had tried so hard to shield her children from the harshness of the world, but it had found them anyway. She looked at Matthew, her heart breaking at the sight of his tear-streaked face. She pulled him into a hug, holding him close. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. We'll get through this." But as they left the school, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. She had fought so hard to provide for her children, to give them a chance at a better life, and now, even in this new world of wealth and privilege, they were still being judged, still being hurt. She knew she had to do something. She couldn't let her children suffer because of the choices she had made. When they arrived back at the penthouse, Alexander was waiting for them. He had heard what had happened and was visibly concerned. He knelt down in front of Matthew, his expression soft. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. "I heard you had a rough day. I'm really sorry about that." Matthew looked at him, his eyes filled with confusion and anger. "They were saying things about Mom," he said, his voice trembling. "They said she was only here because of your money, that she was a gold digger." Alexander's heart sank, a mix of anger and sadness washing over him. He looked up at Isabella, seeing the pain in her eyes, and he knew that this wasn't just about Matthew. It was about all of them. The world they were living in was harsh, judgmental, and filled with people who would never understand the love and sacrifice that had brought them to this point. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Alexander found Isabella sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands. He walked over to her, sitting down beside her. "Isabella," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted this for you or the kids." Isabella looked up, her eyes red from crying. "It's not your fault, Alexander," she said, her voice breaking. "But I can't do this. I can't watch my children suffer because of me. They deserve better than this. They deserve a normal life away from all of this." Alexander felt his heart clench at her words. "But I want to give you a better life," he said, his voice trembling. "I want to take care of you, to give you everything you deserve." Isabella shook her head, her eyes filled with pain. "I don't want your money, Alexander. I never did. I just wanted a chance to build something for myself, for my children. And now, I feel like I'm losing myself in all of this." Alexander reached out, taking her hand in his. "You're not losing yourself," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever known, Isabella. You've been through so much and you're still here, still fighting. Let me help you. Let me fight with you." Isabella looked at him, her heart torn. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, could feel the love he still had for her. But she also knew that she couldn't stay here, couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. She needed to find herself again, to find her own strength, away from the shadow of Alexander's wealth. "I need to leave, Alexander," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I need to find a way to stand on my own 2 feet, to give my children the life they deserve. I can't do that here." Alexander felt his heart shatter at her words. He had fought so hard to bring her back into his life, to make things right, and now she was slipping away from him again. He could see the determination in her eyes, the resolve that had always been a part of who she was, and as much as it hurt, he knew he couldn't hold her back. "Okay," he said, his voice breaking. "If that's what you need, then I'll support you. I'll do whatever it takes to help you get back on your feet." Isabella nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Alexander," she whispered. "For everything." The next morning, Alexander helped Isabella pack her things. He arranged for a small apartment for her and the children, something modest but comfortable, a place where they could start over. It wasn't easy. Every moment felt like a goodbye, a reminder of the love they had once shared, and the distance that now separated them. As they stood in the doorway of the penthouse, Alexander looked at Isabella, his heart aching. "This isn't the end, you know," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'll always be here for you, for the kids, no matter what." Isabella looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I know," she said softly, "and I'll always be grateful for that." They embraced, a hug filled with all the unspoken words, all the love and pain that still lingered between them. And then, with a heavy heart, Isabella turned and walked away, her children by her side. Alexander watched them go, his heart breaking but also filled with a sense of hope. He knew that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just a new chapter, a chance for both of them to grow, to find their own strength, and maybe, one day, to find their way back to each other. And as the door closed behind them, Alexander knew that he would never stop fighting for the woman he loved, no matter how far she went. The weeks after Isabella moved out were challenging for everyone involved. Alexander found himself waking up to an empty penthouse, a space that suddenly felt far too large and far too quiet, without the sound of children's laughter or Isabella's gentle presence. It was like he was living in a shell, a reminder of everything he had lost. He threw himself into his work, trying to distract himself from the emptiness, but he found that no matter how many deals he closed or how much money he made, it couldn't fill the void left by Isabella and her children. On the other hand, Isabella was finding her way one day at a time. The small apartment Alexander had arranged for her was modest but comfortable, a place where she and her children could finally feel like they had a home again. It wasn't easy. The transition from living in a luxurious penthouse to making her own way was filled with challenges. But Isabella knew she had made the right choice. She needed to prove to herself and to her children that they could make it on their own, that they didn't need to depend on anyone else to survive. She found work at a local bakery, taking on early morning shifts so that she could be home when her children finished school. It wasn't glamorous and it didn't pay much, but it gave her a sense of purpose. She loved the rhythm of the work, the kneading of the dough, the warmth of the ovens, the simple joy of creating something that brought people happiness. It reminded her of a time when life had been simpler, when she and Alexander had dreamed of a future that was about more than just money and success. The children were adjusting too. Matthew, who had been so affected by the bullying at his previous school, found new friends. The new school was smaller, less intimidating, and the teachers were kind and understanding. Isabella watched as her son slowly regained his confidence, and it filled her heart with a sense of pride. They were making it. One day at a time, they were finding their way. Despite the distance between them, Alexander never truly left Isabella's life. He called often, always checking in on the children, making sure they had everything they needed. He respected her space, but he wanted her to know that he was still there, still willing to support her in any way she would allow. He would visit occasionally, bringing groceries or little gifts for the kids, and every time Isabella felt her heart ache. She could see how much he cared, how much he wanted to be a part of their lives, but she still wasn't sure if they could ever find their way back to what they once had. One afternoon, Alexander showed up at the bakery. It was a slow day, and Isabella was wiping down the counter when she looked up and saw him standing there, a small smile on his face. He looked different, more relaxed, less like the high-powered businessman she had always known. He was wearing jeans and a simple shirt, and for a moment, it was as if they were back in college, before everything had become so complicated. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. Isabella smiled, surprised but happy to see him. "Hey," she replied. "What brings you here?" Alexander shrugged, his eyes meeting hers. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." Isabella nodded, her heart warming at his words. "I'm good," she said. "The kids are good too. We're managing." Alexander looked around the bakery, the scent of fresh bread filling the air. "This place suits you," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "You look happy here." Isabella smiled, her eyes softening. "I am," she said. "It's not much, but it's ours. It feels right." Alexander nodded, a sense of peace washing over him. He had spent so much time trying to give Isabella everything he thought she wanted, but now he realized that what she needed was something far simpler, something that made her feel grounded and whole. "I'm glad," he said, his voice sincere. "You deserve to be happy, Isabella." There was a moment of silence between them, a moment filled with all the unspoken words and emotions that still lingered. Isabella looked at Alexander, her heart swelling with a mix of love and uncertainty. She could see how much he had changed, how much he was trying to understand her, to support her without overwhelming her. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where they could find a way to be together again. not as the people they once were, but as the people they had become. "Do you want to stay for a bit?" Isabella asked, her voice soft. "I was just about to make some coffee." Alexander's face lit up, a hopeful smile spreading across his lips. "I'd love that," he said. They sat together in the small seating area of the bakery, sipping their coffee and talking about everything and nothing. It was easy, natural, and for a moment it was as if all the pain and heartache had faded away, leaving only the love that had always been there, beneath the surface. Over the next few weeks, Alexander became a more regular presence in Isabella's life. He would stop by the bakery whenever he could, sometimes bringing lunch, other times just to say hello. He would spend time with the children, taking them to the park or helping them with their schoolwork. Slowly, a new kind of relationship began to form between them, one built on understanding, respect, and a shared desire to create a better future for the children. One Saturday afternoon, Alexander invited Isabella and the children to his penthouse for dinner. Isabella hesitated at first. She wasn't sure if she was ready to step back into that world. But the children were excited at the prospect, and she didn't want to disappoint them. When they arrived, they were greeted by the sight of Alexander in the kitchen, an apron tied around his waist, a look of concentration on his face as he stirred a pot on the stove. "Wow, are you actually cooking?" Isabella asked, her eyes widening in surprise. Alexander looked up, a sheepish smile on his face. "I thought I'd give it a try," he said. "Figured it was about time I learned how to make something other than reservations." Isabella laughed, the sound filling the room and making Alexander's heart swell. It was the first time she had laughed like that in a long time, and it made him realize just how much he had missed her. Missed the way she made everything feel lighter, easier. Dinner was far from perfect. The pasta was overcooked and the sauce was a little too salty, but it was filled with laughter and warmth. The children loved it, and Isabella found herself relaxing, allowing herself to enjoy the moment without worrying about what it meant or what would come next. It was just them, Alexander, Isabella, and the children, sharing a meal and creating memories together. After dinner, as the children played in the living room, Alexander and Isabella stood on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. The air was cool, and Alexander draped a blanket over Isabella's shoulders, his eyes meeting hers. "I know I've made a lot of mistakes, Isabella," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But I want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you need, whatever the kids need, I'm always going to be here." Isabella looked at him, her heart swelling with love. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, could feel the love he still had for her and her children. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to be happy together again. "I know, Alexander," she said, her voice soft. "And I want you to know that I appreciate everything you've done for us. You've changed, you've grown, and maybe we both needed this time to figure things out." Alexander nodded, his heart filled with hope. "Maybe we did," he said. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "But whatever happens next, I want to face it together. You, me, and the kids. As a family." Isabella looked at their joined hands, her heart pounding. She knew it wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt and fear. But as she looked at Alexander, at the man he had become, she knew that she wanted to try. She wanted to fight for the love they had once shared, for the family they could become. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling. "Let's try. Let's see where this goes." Alexander's face broke into a smile, his eyes shining with tears. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and for the first time in a long time, they both felt a sense of peace. They had come a long way, and there was still a long road ahead, but they were ready to face it, together. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the city lights twinkling below them, they knew that they had found something worth fighting for, a love that had withstood the test of time, of hardship, and of change. They had found each other again, and this time, they weren't going to let go. A few months had passed, and things were finally starting to feel stable for Alexander, Isabella, and the children. They had built a life that, while unconventional, was filled with love and warmth. Isabella was finding joy in her work at the bakery. The children were thriving in their new school, and Alexander was balancing his demanding career with his newfound family responsibilities. It was a time of growth, of healing, and of a love that was rekindling slowly but surely. One Friday evening, Isabella and the kids were at the penthouse for dinner. It had become a regular occurrence, Alexander cooking, or at least trying to, while Isabella helped, the children playing in the living room or setting the table. The atmosphere was warm and filled with laughter, and for the first time in a long time, Isabella allowed herself to believe that they could be truly happy together. As they sat down for dinner, Alexander's phone began to ring, its sharp sound cutting through the warm laughter. He looked at the screen, his face tightening as he saw the name of the caller, one of his most important business partners. He excused himself, stepping into the other room to take the call. Isabella watched him go, a sense of unease settling in her chest. She had seen that look on his face before, the look that meant something was wrong. After what felt like an eternity, Alexander returned, his expression tense. He sat down attempting to smile, but Isabella could see the worry in his eyes. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Alexander hesitated, glancing at the children who were busy chatting about their day. He took a deep breath, turning his gaze back to Isabella. "It's just some business stuff," he said. "Nothing you need to worry about." But Isabella could tell that it was more than just business stuff. There was a heaviness in his voice, a weight that seemed to press down on him. She reached out, placing her hand on his. "Alexander," she said gently, "you can tell me. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of love and fear. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There's a problem with one of my major projects," he admitted. "Some of my business partners, they're pulling out and it's threatening the whole deal. If I can't secure the funding, I could lose everything." Isabella's heart sank. She knew how much Alexander had put into his business, how much it meant to him, and the thought of him losing everything he had worked so hard for was almost too much to bear. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Alexander shook his head, a look of frustration crossing his face. "I don't know," he said. "I've been trying to secure new investors, but it's been difficult. There are people out there who want to see me fail, who want to bring me down, and they're using this opportunity to do just that." Isabella could see the pain in his eyes, the fear of losing everything he had built. She knew that Alexander wasn't just worried about himself. He was worried about her, about the children, about the life they were trying to build together. She squeezed his hand, her voice filled with determination. "We'll figure it out," she said. "Whatever happens, we'll get through it. You're not alone, Alexander." The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Alexander was constantly on the phone, meeting with lawyers, with potential investors, with anyone who might be able to help save his business. The penthouse, once filled with laughter and warmth, was now filled with a sense of unease, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. One evening, Alexander came home, his face etched with exhaustion. Isabella was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and she looked up as he walked in. She could see the defeat in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped, and her heart broke for him. She put down the knife she was using to chop vegetables and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around him. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice filled with love. "Whatever happens, we have each other. That's all that matters." Alexander held her close, his heart aching. He had spent so much of his life fighting for success, for power, for wealth, and now in this moment, he realized that none of it mattered if he didn't have Isabella and the children by his side. They were what mattered. They were what made his life worth living. The next morning, Alexander received a call that changed everything. One of his longtime business associates, a man who had always believed in him, had decided to invest in the project, saving it from collapse. It was a lifeline, a chance to keep everything he had worked for. Alexander felt a wave of relief wash over him. his heart pounding as he realized that for now at least they were safe. He immediately called Isabella, his voice trembling as he spoke. "It's going to be okay," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "We're going to be okay." Isabella let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, Alexander," she whispered. "I'm so happy for you." That evening, Alexander came home, a smile on his face for the first time in days. He pulled Isabella into his arms, holding her close, and for a moment, they simply stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace. It was a moment of pure relief, of knowing that they had faced the storm and come out on the other side, still standing, still together. The following weekend, Alexander decided to take Isabella and the children on a trip to the countryside. He wanted to get away from the chaos of the city, from the business that had nearly torn everything apart. He wanted to spend time with the people he loved, to remind himself of what truly mattered. They rented a small cottage by a lake, surrounded by rolling hills and trees that swayed gently in the breeze. It was peaceful, quiet, and exactly what they needed. They spent their days exploring the woods, playing games by the lake, and cooking simple meals together. It was a time of healing, of reconnecting, and of remembering why they had fought so hard to be together. One evening, as the sun began to set, Alexander and Isabella sat by the lake, watching the children play in the water. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the water reflecting the colors like a mirror. Alexander reached out, taking Isabella's hand in his eyes filled with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said, his voice trembling. "You've been my rock, Isabella. You've given me strength when I needed it most." Isabella looked at him, her heart swelling with love. "We've given each other strength," she said softly. "We've faced so much, but we're still here, and that's what matters." Alexander smiled, his eyes misting over. "I love you, Isabella," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I love you more than anything in this world." Isabella felt tears well up in her eyes, her heart overflowing with love. "I love you too, Alexander," she whispered, "and I know that whatever comes our way, we'll face it together." They kissed, the world around them fading away as they held each other close. In that moment, they knew that they had faced their greatest challenge yet, and they had won. Their love had been tested, but it had emerged stronger, more resilient and more beautiful than ever. And as they sat there watching the sun dip below the horizon, they knew that the future was theirs to create, together, side by side, no matter what. They had learned that true strength didn't come from wealth or power. It came from love, from family, and from the unwavering belief that no matter what, they would always have each other. It was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of something even greater. A life filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a future that was theirs to build, one day at a time. And they knew, without a doubt, that they were ready for whatever came next. The weeks following their trip to the countryside marked a new beginning for Alexander and Isabella. After everything they had been through, they were finally able to breathe again, to truly embrace the life they had worked so hard to create. The bond between them had grown stronger, built on the trust, love, and resilience that had seen them through some of the darkest days of their lives. Alexander made a conscious decision to prioritize his family above everything else. For years, his business had consumed him, leaving little time for anything else. But now, he understood that his true wealth lay not in the money he made or the deals he closed, but in the moments he spent with Isabella and the children. He began delegating more of his responsibilities at work, allowing himself the freedom to be present for the people who mattered most. Isabella, too, had found her place in the world. The small bakery where she worked had become more than just a job. It was a part of her identity. She loved the rhythm of the work, the warmth of the oven, and the joy of seeing the smiles on her customers' faces. She had also formed deep friendships with her co-workers, people who supported her and cheered her on as she built a new life for herself and her family. One sunny Saturday morning, Isabella stood behind the counter of the bakery, her hands dusted with flour as she rolled out dough. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see Alexander and the children walking in, smiles on their faces. Her heart swelled with love as she watched them approach. "Hey, Mom!" Matthew called out, his voice filled with excitement. "Look what we made for you!" In his hands he held a bouquet of wildflowers, their bright colors vibrant against the green stems. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she took the bouquet, her heart swelling with emotion. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to her son's forehead. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said softly. "They're beautiful." Alexander smiled, his eyes meeting Isabella's. "We thought you could use a little bit of color in here," he said, his voice warm. Isabella laughed, her eyes shining with love. "It's perfect," she said. "You all are perfect." She put the bouquet in a vase on the counter, the bright flowers adding a cheerful touch to the bakery. The children ran off to look at the display case filled with pastries, their laughter echoing through the small shop. Alexander walked over to Isabella, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I was thinking," he said, his voice soft, "maybe we could take a trip, just the two of us. I know we've been busy, but I'd love to spend some time with you. Just you." Isabella turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his. She could see the love in his eyes, the desire to continue building their life together. She smiled, her heart swelling. "I'd love that," she said. Alexander pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, his heart filled with love. "Good," he said, "because I can't think of anything better than spending time with the woman I love." A few weeks later, Alexander and Isabella found themselves standing in front of a small cottage by the sea. The air was crisp, the scent of salt water filling their lungs as they looked out at the waves crashing against the shore. It was a place far away from the hustle and bustle of the city, a place where they could truly relax and be themselves. They spent their days walking along the beach, collecting seashells and talking about everything and nothing. They cooked together, simple meals that they shared by candlelight, the sound of the ocean in the background. It was a time of reconnection, of remembering why they had fallen in love all those years ago, and of embracing the people they had become. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the cottage, watching the sun set over the horizon, Alexander reached for Isabella's hand, his eyes filled with emotion. "I know I've said it before," he began, his voice trembling, "but I need you to know how much you mean to me. You've changed my life, Isabella. You've made me realize what truly matters." Isabella looked at him, her heart swelling with love. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, could feel the depth of his love for her. She squeezed his hand, her voice soft. "And you've changed mine, Alexander. You've given me a second chance, a chance to build a life filled with love and happiness. And I'll always be grateful for that." They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the waves filling the air around them. Alexander turned to her, his heart pounding. "Marry me, Isabella," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Marry me and let's spend the rest of our lives building this dream together." Isabella felt tears well up in her eyes, her heart overflowing with love. She smiled, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Yes, Alexander. 1,000 times yes." Alexander pulled her into his arms, his lips meeting hers in a kiss filled with love and promise. It was a moment of pure joy, of knowing that they had fought for each other, and that they had won. They had faced challenges, heartbreak, and uncertainty. But through it all, they had found each other again. And now, they were ready to face whatever the future held, together. When they returned home, Alexander and Isabella began planning their wedding. It was a simple affair, held in a small garden filled with flowers and surrounded by the people who meant the most to them. The children stood by their side, their smiles wide as they watched their mother and Alexander exchange vows. As Alexander looked at Isabella, his heart filled with love and gratitude. He knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a future that was theirs to create. "I promise to love you," Alexander said, his voice trembling. "To stand by your side, to support you in every dream, every challenge. You are my heart, my home, and I am so grateful to have found my way back to you." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, her heart swelling with love. "And I promise to love you," she said, her voice breaking. "To walk beside you, to face every challenge with you. You are my heart, my strength, and I am so blessed to have found you again." They exchanged rings, their hands trembling as they slipped them onto each other's fingers, and as they kissed, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the love that had brought them to this moment. The months that followed were filled with happiness and growth. Alexander continued to balance his work with his commitment to his family, taking on fewer responsibilities and focusing on the projects that truly mattered to him. He found joy in the simple moments, taking the children to school, cooking dinner with Isabella, and spending quiet evenings together as a family. Isabella continued her work at the bakery, her love for her job growing each day. She also began teaching a baking class at a community center, sharing her passion with others and giving back to the community that had welcomed her and her children with open arms. It was her way of paying forward the kindness she had received, and it filled her heart with a sense of purpose. Together, Alexander and Isabella built a life that was real, that was filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a future that was theirs to create. They knew that there would still be challenges ahead. Life was never perfect, and there would always be ups and downs. But they also knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their home watching the sun set over the horizon, Alexander looked at Isabella, his heart filled with love. He reached for her hand, his eyes meeting hers. "Here's to us," he said softly, "to everything we've been through and everything that's still to come." Isabella smiled, her heart swelling with love. "To us," she echoed, her voice filled with emotion, "and to the love that brought us here." They leaned in, their foreheads touching as they held each other close, the world around them fading away. They knew that their journey was just beginning, that there were still so many adventures to be had, so many memories to be made, and they were ready for it all, knowing that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. Their love had been tested, but it had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more beautiful than ever. And as they looked towards the future, they knew that their greatest adventure was still ahead. A story of love, family, and a life lived fully, deeply, and with purpose. Years had passed since that fateful day when Alexander Davenport, a man with all the wealth one could imagine but without the one thing that truly mattered, found Isabella, the love he had lost, begging on the street with her 3 children. That day had marked the beginning of a journey filled with challenges, tears, hope, and above all, love. Together, they had faced hardships, had rebuilt trust, and had forged a life that neither of them had ever imagined was possible. The world around them had changed, but the most significant changes had happened within them. Alexander was no longer the cold, business-driven millionaire, obsessed with success. He was now a devoted husband and father, a man who found true joy in the simple moments shared with his family. Isabella, too, had grown. She had overcome the challenges of the past, had found her strength, and had built a life that was filled with purpose and happiness. Their home was no longer just a lavish penthouse in the heart of the city. It was now a place filled with laughter, warmth, and love. After they married, Alexander and Isabella moved out of the penthouse, choosing instead to build a home that felt like them. They bought a beautiful house on the outskirts of the city, with a large garden where the children could play, where Isabella could grow flowers, and where Alexander could find peace away from the demands of the business world. The garden became their sanctuary. On sunny mornings, Isabella would sit on the porch, sipping her coffee while watching the children run around, their laughter filling the air. Matthew, who had grown into a confident young teenager, loved to help his mother in the garden, planting vegetables and learning about different flowers. His younger siblings, Emma and Jacob, would chase each other around the yard, their energy seemingly endless. And Alexander would join them whenever he could, his heart swelling with love every time he looked at his family. One warm spring morning, Isabella stood in the garden, her hands covered in soil as she planted a row of sunflowers along the fence. The sun was shining, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. She looked up to see Alexander walking towards her, a smile on his face, his eyes filled with love. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, his voice warm. Isabella smiled, her heart fluttering at the sight of him. Even after all these years, he still had the power to make her feel like the luckiest woman in the world. "Good morning," she replied. "What brings you out here so early?" Alexander shrugged, his eyes twinkling. "I thought I'd come help you," he said. "And maybe steal a kiss or two while I'm at it." Isabella laughed, shaking her head. "You're incorrigible," she said, but she leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips. "But I wouldn't have it any other way." They worked side by side, planting flowers and weeding the garden, their hands covered in soil, their laughter filling the air. It was moments like these, simple, unremarkable moments, that made life beautiful. They didn't need extravagant vacations or fancy parties. All they needed was each other and the love they shared. Alexander's business had also changed over the years. After nearly losing everything, he had taken a step back, reevaluating what truly Emmy. He had sold off some of his more demanding ventures, choosing instead to focus on projects that brought him fulfillment. He started a foundation dedicated to providing opportunities for underprivileged youth, scholarships, mentorship programs, and resources to help them build a better future. It was work that gave him purpose, that made him feel like he was truly making a difference in the world. One afternoon, Alexander stood in front of a group of young students, his heart pounding as he spoke to them about his journey, about the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned, and the importance of never giving up on oneself. He looked out at the young faces filled with hope and determination, and he knew that this was where he was meant to be. It wasn't about making money or building an empire. It was about using his success to lift others up, to give back in a meaningful way. As he finished his speech, the room erupted in applause, and Alexander felt a sense of pride and fulfillment that he had never known before. He stepped down from the stage, making his way to the back of the room where Isabella stood, a proud smile on her face. She reached for his hand, her eyes meeting his. "You were amazing," she said softly, her voice filled with love. Alexander smiled, his heart swelling. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You're my inspiration, Isabella. You always have been." Isabella leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to his cheek. "And you're mine," she whispered. Their life was not without challenges. No life ever is. There were still moments of doubt, moments of fear, moments when the past seemed to loom over them like a shadow. But they faced those moments together, hand in hand, knowing that they could overcome anything as long as they had each other. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the children gathered around them. Matthew spoke up, his voice filled with curiosity. "Mom, Dad," he said, "can you tell us how you met?" Isabella looked at Alexander, her heart swelling with love. It was a story they had told before, but one that never lost its magic. She smiled, nodding. "Of course, sweetheart," she said. She began to tell the story of how they had met in college, of the love that had blossomed between them, and of the challenges they had faced. She spoke of the years they had spent apart, of the day Alexander found her on the street, and of the journey they had taken to find their way back to each other. As she spoke, Alexander watched her, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. He could see the emotion in her eyes, the love she still held for him, and he knew that despite everything they had been through, they had found something truly extraordinary. A love that had withstood the test of time, of hardship, and of change. When Isabella finished the story, the children were silent for a moment, their eyes wide with wonder. Then Emma spoke up, her voice filled with awe. "That's the best love story ever," she said. Alexander smiled, his eyes misting over. "It is," he said softly, "because it's ours." They sat together, the warmth of the fire filling the room, and for a moment, everything was perfect. It was a moment filled with love, with hope, and with the promise of a future that was theirs to create. Years continued to pass, and the love between Alexander and Isabella only grew stronger. They watched as their children grew. Matthew became a young man, confident and kind, a reflection of the love and support he had received from his parents. Emma and Jacob, too, thrived, their laughter and energy filling the house, their hearts open and full of love. One summer evening, Alexander and Isabella stood in the garden watching as their children played in the yard. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the garden, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers. Alexander looked at Isabella, his heart swelling with love. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. Isabella looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. "We have," she said, "and I wouldn't change a single thing." Alexander reached for her hand, his eyes meeting hers. "Neither would I," he said. "You're my everything, Isabella. You always have been and you always will be." Isabella smiled, her heart overflowing with love. "And you're mine," she whispered. They leaned in, their foreheads touching, and in that moment, they knew that they had found something truly extraordinary. Their journey had been filled with challenges, with moments of doubt and fear, but through it all, they had found each other. They had built a life that was real, that was filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a future that was theirs to create. And as they stood there watching their children play, the sun setting behind them, they knew that their greatest adventure was still ahead. It was a story of love, of resilience, of a family that had been brought together against all odds. A story that was far from over, because, as they had learned, love was not about perfection. It was about choosing each other, every single day, no matter what. It was about building a life together, one filled with laughter, with tears, with moments of pure joy and moments of struggle. And as they looked towards the future, they knew that, whatever came their way, they would face it together. And that, they realized, was all they ever needed.